9:47, the board meeting. John Deal in his secure bunker, joining us via Skype. Jane Duker, attorney and local gadfly, and editorial page editor Tony Messenger, who can be read and seen at stltoday.com. Good morning, Tony Messenger.
Good morning, McGraw.
The Affordable Care Act had an interesting week. One court said it's the worst thing in the world and it's not allowed to be subsidized. The other one said everything's fine and perfect, all within 1 hour of itself.
Actually, neither of the courts said either of those things. But here's actually the more important thing about the Affordable Care Act this week. Harvard researchers have now published a study in the New England Journal of Medicine showing that 10.3 million people, at least, could be as high as 17 based on their statistical analysis, now have insurance that didn't have insurance, and that the numbers continue to rise. That's what the Affordable Care Act was for. That's what's happening. That's what's making America better. But to the court rulings, there was a ruling in the D.C. Circuit Court that was a panel of the court, and a ruling in the Richmond, Virginia Circuit Court, or appeals court, that was the full appeals court, that contradicted each other. And they came within an hour of each other. And I love how this happens politically. The D.C. Circuit Court basically said that because Congress used the word state before exchanges, their intent was that only people in the state exchanges could get the federal subsidy, which is what ultimately makes the Affordable Care Act affordable for most people. And so in those states that states that decided not to put their own exchange into effect because their legislature is cowardly, like in Missouri, for instance, that the court ruled those people couldn't get subsidies. So ultimately, if this were to become law, which it won't, the government would have to say to those millions of people across the country that are getting affordable insurance right now, sorry, we didn't mean it, we're taking it away. The Richmond court ruled, no. Congress' intent here is more important than the one-word state before exchange. Congress clearly intended the program to work together. Whether or not some states passed exchanges is immaterial because the federal government did that for them. That's what was intended in the law, and ultimately that's what's going to maintain the law. This will ultimately go to the Supreme Court, but here's what matters. The Supreme Court's already decided this issue. In their Affordable Care Act ruling, the Roberts Court, in keeping the Affordable Care Act 2 years ago, already said that there's this three-legged stool, that they all work together, that they're intended to work together. So they already interpreted congressional intent. That was the basis of their decision. Even the dissenter, Scalia, agree that three-legged stool is part of the congressional intent. So even if this makes it to the Supreme Court, the subsidies are going to continue. The Affordable Care Act are going to continue. Millions and millions of people are going to continue to have more affordable insurance than they had before, and that's the real news.
John Deal.
Well, fortunately, a lot of what Tony was saying was breaking up on me, so it's probably good. But the parts I did hear, I don't think he could be more incorrect about this.
Oh, we've lost John. That's okay. Whatever he was going to say wasn't going to be the truth anyway.
Go ahead, John.
I guess that's good both ways.
We got you back. Go ahead.
The D.C. court is kind of the farm team for the Supreme Court. So when you get decisions out of the D.C. circuit, those are pretty telling. And what the Affordable Care Act
But it was the panel of the court. It wasn't the full appeals court. I know. Let's just say it was a panel of the appeals court. Okay. It wasn't the full appeals court. I
understand. Okay. So let me finish. Okay?
Go ahead.
The Affordable Care Act has two different schemes for exchanges. One is exchanges which are created by the states, and one which are exchanges created by the federal government. Okay? And the subsidies applied only to exchanges which are created by the states. Okay? That's what the D.C. panel held. So this is probably a situation, I think back, and it's kind of almost ironic that something like this would start bringing down Obamacare, when Nancy Pelosi said, well, we'll find out what's in the bill when we read it. Well, perhaps if they read it at the time, whether it was inadvertent or not inadvertent, you would realize that that's the section that this applies to. okay, are exchanges created by the states, not exchanges created by the federal government. And there's nothing in the law or case law which suggests that just because the federal government acts that they stand in the shoes of the state. We have a federalist system here, not a system where it's just whatever the federal government says goes all the time. So there are literally dozens of these types of lawsuits with major significant flaws in the law. Now, if you go back and say what Tony was saying on the ACA, that, hey, wait a minute, the court said this is a three-legged stool, we need to look at congressional intent, then why did they throw out the state's mandatory joining of Medicaid? Okay, because states do have rights, okay, that what the law says does matter, and you can't just construe congressional intent to be a scapegoat for doing in this place. It says subsidies for exchanges created by states.
Jane Duker.
Well, I mean, I disagree. I think the ruling that's relying on one word that says state somehow changes the whole scheme. They're interpreting one word in the law to assume something that the Supreme Court has already decided what this actually does. So you can use the tired line about Nancy Pelosi that, we'll read the bill. Well, the Supreme Court did read the bill, and they decided and they said exactly what this was, and they relied upon this scheme to determine the mandate, to determine, what parts of this were constitutional and what parts weren't. And so I think that, they're going to have trouble getting that decision upheld. And so the key is, do the Republicans want to be the party that stands for yanking insurance? That's something they're going to have to, so as they cheer about this and as they, gloat over, a blip in the radar, do they want to be the party that has absolutely no solution for health care? And does this state want to be part of that? And that's, sort of what the policy discussion is.
Elena Kagan, the liberal, I believe, wrote the opinion in which giving the states, saying the states have rights, the states can reject this money if they want to.
Well, just because...
which I find interesting.
Right, but just because the states have certain rights doesn't mean they have all rights, and that doesn't change the actual provisions of the bill.
Right.
It's two different analyses.
You know what I
Jane,
find?
Do you agree with me, Jane, but do you agree with me? It said that this applies to exchanges set up by the states. That's what the law says.
Well, no, I disagree. I think
that's what it says.
In other places of the law makes it very clear that there's no difference between the state exchanges and the federal exchanges.
No, it
but
doesn't.
yes, it does. That's what the Richmond court ruled. You need to read the Richmond ruling. The Richmond ruling is very clear, and it uses almost some of the identical language that the Supreme Court already used regarding the three-legged stool. Here's what I find really interesting about John's argument. Do you remember when we had the discussion not long ago about the really horrible tax cut bill that the legislature passed, in which Governor Nixon said, if you read the plain wording of the bill that they passed, it's possible that the top tax bracket in Missouri gets removed. And what Republicans in Missouri said in response to that was, you have to pay attention to legislative intent. They argued legislative intent, not the words. And now, because it helps them, they're switching from the words to legislative intent. I find that interesting.
Tony, you just concede the argument of healthcare. That's number one distraction, is to change the subject. Okay.
Well, I had already won the argument.
Go ahead, John.
Is to change the subject. The law, the federal subsidies apply to exchanges set up by the state. This is going to go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to follow what the D.C. court has. The law is going to fall along with Medicaid expansion.
So if the full D.C. appeals court, which hasn't heard it yet, which by the way now has some new appointments on the court from President Barack Obama, approved by the Democratic Senate, if the D.C. appeals court rules the same way that Richmond did, do you agree? Do you agree that the Supreme Court will then follow the D.C. appeals court, like you just said?
I think they're going to follow the D.C. panel.
All right, there you go. We're officially out of time. That was relatively civil. Relatively, yeah.
It helps when John's breaking up and we can't hear his blah 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 blah.
You can just kind of hit the mute button on me, right?
John Deal live via Skype from the undisclosed bunker. John Deal, have a safe week. We'll talk to you next Thursday.
Bye.
Jane Duker, have a good day.
I will.
Tony Messenger, back to the salt mines.
Good to see you, McGraw.
Good to see you.
Play that music again.
Have
We
a
need
great
that
day,
bumper.
everybody. A tout à l'heure.